sangate bodhi swaha gate gate bara gate bara sangate bodhi swaha gate gate bara gate bara sangate bodhi swaha gate gate bara gate bara sangate bodhi swaha gate gate bara.
Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think that we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, doctor, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's podcast. I'm back with Jonathan Crowley for further conversation in our series of talks about his practice as a meditator, development as a teacher within the organization, the Goenka Vipassana organization, I should say, and continuing spiritual journey. And we left off on the last podcast conversation, which we encourage everyone to check out to get some continuity. But the last conversation left off with talking about Jonathan's work in prisons and bringing meditation to prisoners, and also becoming more aware of the dynamics of race and racism as it pertained to not just American society and white privilege, but also within the meditation center. In this conversation, we're going to somewhat shift gears, although all these things are somewhat related, and we're going to talk about his development from being a meditator in the tradition to being tapped to be a teacher and then becoming a teacher, and what that experience was like, how that was different. Obviously, being in an authoritative role of helping students, welcoming students in and bringing them the Dhamma is different than sitting, and also different from many aspects of serving, and learn more about behind the scenes of what that experience was like in becoming a teacher and then being a teacher for many years. So with that lead in, Jonathan, thanks so much for coming back and joining us and continuing this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Joa. It's been really great. I almost feel like I'm, sort of like it's great. You're an old student, and it's just been great just to kind of banter back and forth about our experiences, and both appreciations and kind of examining some of the more critical aspects of everything, and related to those experiences. And yeah, so we were talking about some of the early courses at Donaldson, and that was kind of a culminating moment, I would say, for me as an old student. I had taken a pretty large role in organizing those courses, and it was actually at that time that I think the two assistant teachers who I was working with. So I managed those early courses at Donaldson Correctional Facility, and the two teachers who were serving alongside me, Rick Crutcher and Bruce Stewart, I think they began to then talk with the director here in Shelburne about appointing me as an assistant teacher. So I think that's kind of where things had gone. And I think it was just a really culminating moment, I think. And then I think it was shortly after that I think Barry Lapping at the Shelburne Falls Meditation Center formally asked me if I would consider training up.
Yeah, so that's a big moment in one's life as a meditator. Many meditators listening to this have been with the tradition for many years. Only a very few select of them have actually been tapped to be teachers. So this is an experience that many people within the tradition don't have an understanding for, haven't experienced. I remember one of the things I used to hear when people would ask about the process of becoming a teacher. The phrase would always come in an answer of, well, if you're looking to be a teacher or interested in being a teacher, then probably you're not going to be one. Those aren't the kind of people they look for. And that was kind of the only cryptic response that was received for those younger students that were just wondering what that process is.
Yeah,
But talk a
yeah.
bit about your feeling about, like, did you have ambitions in wanting to be a teacher? Did it come as a complete surprise? Did it feel kind of a natural progression? And what was it like when you accepted and took that mental and trained?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's hilarious to hear you say that, because I've been on the other end of saying those very things. Like, well, if you want to be, become an assistant teacher, it's likely that you're not, it's not appropriate, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, I think, just like in any organization, and certainly this was the case for me, by the time I was being asked to train and be appointed, I'd already thought about that for so many years. And yet, I couldn't ever express that desire, or, because that would be sort of seen as some kind of liability, or some kind of weakness, or a manifestation of my own ego. But I've talked with many old students who have that, and who've then, since been appointed assistant teachers, and just how, yeah, you kind of almost have to pretend you don't want to be an assistant teacher. But there's I think there's positive elements, and maybe more challenging elements of that. But I think that the whole system ends up, I think, creating this kind of false, um, um, sense of false ego, I guess, around that whole process, because everyone becomes aware that, well, they shouldn't express a desire for that, and so therefore they have to, sort of be self-deprecating around that whole piece, or whatever and so I was in that same place, and yet like I say, I certainly did harbor a desire to serve in that way, and was really moved when I was asked to. I was aware that it was a real sense of responsibility. It was also definitely you know an expression of, I think, confidence in um, a few teachers who I'd known for a number of years, and so that of course felt great, in the sense that, and I also knew it was going to be a very different, different experience to be in front of students, than what I had imagined it would be. But yeah, so that was definitely the beginning, um, and I think I didn't realize just what kind, what sort of transition, you know, what was going to happen for me as a result of training up and being appointed an assistant teacher.
So you referenced that in being a teacher, it was somewhat different than you'd imagined all those times of sitting and looking up and seeing the teacher on the dais, that when you were actually that person on the dais, it was a different experience than as you'd conceptualized. Can you go into what that felt like and in what ways it was different from whatever it was you had been expecting or anticipating?
Yeah, well, typically the training to become an assistant teacher is a process where you then attend 3, sometimes 4, maybe more, but at least a minimum of 3, and 4 or 5, retreat courses where you are observing much more closely the role of the assistant teacher, and then sort of stepping into taking on parts of those roles, maybe taking on one of the functions, which is called checking, where assistant teachers call students up in small groups to just ask some basic questions about how they're tracking the instructions, and just how they're just checking in to see how they're doing. And then it proceeds, from to then fielding questions, both one-on-one privately, and then also in a group situation, with the observation and supervision of a training teacher. So I underwent that, and I think I quickly realized that I was, so much of it was really about facilitating the framework of the 10-day course, right? And so in some ways it was, it was both fulfilling in the sense that, of course, for me, I think for a lot of old students, and certainly for a lot of assistant teachers, ATs, that they see that 10-day experience as a threshold experience that can lead new students and returning students onto a lifetime path of embracing the Dhamma in a very profound way throughout their life. And so the course, the retreat framework is obviously designed to give a positive, positive experience. And there's a lot going on, obviously, because just as I did, as we talked about on my first 10-day course, it was super, super hard, and many new students are undergoing a profound transformation in those 10 days, their first 10-day course, and you're you're facilitating that. You're providing sort of the container of that, and so the training really, was about how to really articulate that framework well and succinctly, and in a way that also expressed the highest inspiration of the path, as well as grounding it in just a sense of loving kindness and compassion for what the students were undergoing as they underwent, which I think what most people would agree is a pretty arduous experience, certainly for the first time around, but also for, on many continuing retreats for many returning students.
Right. So that's a bit about the training process and just getting accustomed to taking the dais, learning about that transition from being practitioner to being instructor, and the training that went through that. Once you became a teacher, a full-fledged teacher, and then you were in charge of courses, approximately, just to get a sense so listeners have an idea of how involved you were and how much you experienced, about approximately how many courses did you conduct, and what was it like growing into a full-fledged teacher and handling the meditative experiences of those students that were coming?
Yeah, so this was, I was asked to start training in 2002, just right after the Donaldson Correctional Facility courses. And that was approximately 15 years after my first 10-day course, during which time I had attended, I don't know, probably at least, I think, over 50 10-day courses, numerous 20-day courses. There's also an old student retreat called the Satipatthana course. It's just for old students. It's only a week long, but it's considered a stepping stone to kind of a requirement for the long courses. And so numerous of those. And then I'd gone to India many times. I'd sat with Goenka, sat, I don't know how many, 30-day courses, and around one or two 45-day courses that were I think at that time, that was the longest retreat that was offered at that time. So, and then, I've been involved, on the service level. I've been involved with the trust here in Shelburne, and, been on many organizing committees of the center, had helped, the children's courses, the, obviously the correctional courses, and then also executive courses. So I was involved on many, many different fronts, with the organization by this time.
That also makes me ask a question about identity. And I'm thinking this because when you talked about taking your first course, you had described in that first interview about, what the experience was like and the difficulty of it, and then kind of coming back and sitting and serving and being involved a bit more in the community, getting to meet other people and having questions at that time, being quite young, wondering how this could lead to development of career, family, or whatever else. And then as you went into last interview talking about your work in the prison courses and your through that discussion, it became clear that this was really this involved. I mean, you were a meditator, in quotes, capital letter, perhaps, of like you weren't flitting between this or that. To use the language that the organization often uses, you were becoming established, or perhaps were established in the technique, and were really on this path of how you were practicing, how you were living, how you were associating with, and so this is kind of a progression of showing that, going from kind of touching this and experiencing it to going back and getting a bit more, being a bit more ingrained, and then really like starting to, and also I remember from last interview, be a representative of some sorts of the organization and the ways that you would take it outside and carry it to others. And now you become a teacher. And so through this whole process, I'm wondering in these years, like, if you were asked to look back on this through the lens of trying to understand what this meant in terms of identity, how did you see this? And I would also qualify that by perhaps you didn't see it at all. I mean, for some people, how they define themselves as their identity is very important, something they really think about and is conscious. For others, it's even if their lifestyle is pretty clear and obvious in some ways, they just don't really think of identity issues. So for you in this time, like, to what degree were you aware of and thinking about and defining your identity? And if so, then how was it being defined?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's like so many aspects of this very, there's a lot of nuances to I think what my answer will be. And it brings into context a lot of different aspects of sort of entering the organization. Even so, as a student, right, you are, as you take more and more 10-day retreats, as you serve more, as you think about, attending the longer retreats, 20, 30, 45, now up to 60 days, um, you know, there is both implicit and explicit sense around, sort of funneling into the organization, but also in one's devotion to Goenkaji. So there are explicit aspects of that where, students are required by the time they're, taking a long course to make a declaration that they are only exclusively working with this tradition, with Goenkaji as their teacher, and with this with the technique and the practice as it's taught by Goenkaji. And so, uh, and this was as I came into the organization, I feel very fortunate because I had actually a lot of contact with Goenkaji while he was still alive. I would say I was maybe on that third or fourth wave of old students who, was around when he was still visiting the center every other year. And then when I was a poly student in India, I had a lot of access to Goenkaji during that time, a lot of contact. There was one point where I was helping to establish a new center in India, and so was in planning meetings with Goenkaji. I certainly didn't have anywhere near the level of relationship that senior teachers and teachers had, but I felt like I had a lot of personal contact with Goenkaji, and so in some ways, a lot of, as I was entering in, a lot of it was also in trying to just get a sense of how I was internalizing that my relationship with Goenkaji, how I was regarding him, and so that was also a whole process. And just to give you, example, I mean, there were times when Goenkaji played, really kind of critical sort of roles, or even I would say interventions with me that were very moving and very, very important for me. There was a time I saw him after I had been involved in a pretty upsetting car accident, and he and Mataji chanted with me for 10 or 20 minutes, just trying to, I think, soothe and assuage me, and there was just some really touching moments around that, and then I mean, I began to experience him, in India, and certainly there was, kind of grappling with him as a teacher with a capital T, and uh, there was certainly a lot of devotion being expressed here in the United States, and I was aware of that, and to some degree, I think initially I had kind of an arm's length distance. I had a kind of a wariness around um, gurudom in general, and so I think I did sort of keep kind of an arm's length distance to when and where I saw that occurring in the organization, both here in the United States, but then in India, of course, it was fairly unbridled. I mean, folks there referred to him as Guruji, and so there were all there was all of these kind of qualifications, because on the one hand, Goenkaji seemed to be eschewing that role and denying that he was in a guru position, but in fact, his audience of students were certainly creating that, or relating to him in that way, and there was a kind of a whole narrative around that, a narrative that went back to his teacher, Sayagyi Bakin. I received messages from senior students and teachers at the time, that Sayagyi Bakin, his teacher, was potentially, going to be the next Maitreya Buddha or a chief disciple, and Goenkaji was going to be either a chief disciple, and there was a lot of kind of deifying of Goenkaji going on all the time, and so. As a Pali student, I was reading a lot of the Pali Canon. I was broadening my knowledge, trying to put this everything, the history of the practice, the tradition, the other strains of Vipassana that are out there, all trying to put all that into context, to go back and seeing that there was this larger there was this larger entity of the Dhamma, and that Goenkaji was teaching one component of it, or one slice of it, or you might say one ray of that, with certain emphases that I was increasingly weighing and trying to understand, and trying to also integrate and make sense of, because it was a very narrowed down version. I mean, just for example, the Buddha taught 40 different objects of contemplation, and Goenkaji was, he focuses really on just the observation of respiration, anapana, and the observation of sensations, in terms of the insight practices connected to Vipassana. And so, I think as I became an assistant teacher, I realized, okay, I'm really signing on here as a representative of this, and there were elements in which I, even though I wanted to be an assistant teacher, I was also kind of, there were parts of it that I was reluctant about. I knew on some level that I was going to need to sort of give up, the kind of, I don't know, for lack of better description, sort of chummy way that I was, in the organization. I, just serving and sitting and just working in a more relaxed way, and just being easygoing. And I knew I was going to have to represent a lot of the rules and regulations, and to really steer students in a way that was compliant with the framework of the 10-day course. So all those pieces were kind of in play. I mean, in many ways, the 10-day course is kind of a Trojan horse, right? It's like, the tradition is offering these 10-day courses at no charge to the public, and, come and see, give it a try. But there is also a kind of a funneling part that if folks are inspired by their experiences and they want to continue, it becomes more and more defined. The understanding of Dhamma, sila, samadhi, and panya, the moral, the pieces around morality and concentration and wisdom become more and more sort of defined in narrower scopes, right? And so, as a budding assistant teacher, I needed to make peace with that. I needed to, and there were in many ways I already had on a lot of levels, but there were still pieces that didn't fully make sense, and so I embraced the role, and kind of wanted to do it in my own sort of more, I don't know, relaxed or casual or informal way. I didn't want to. I'd already experienced some assistant teachers who were very formal, very strict. Um, you know, didn't really embody sort of a more well-rounded or integrated kind of person, and so I knew kind of how I wanted to be an assistant teacher and how I didn't want to be an assistant teacher.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a lot of fodder for thought. And as you're saying that, it makes me think of like being a student. I was a student in the Goenka tradition, never a teacher for clarification, but being a student, there was always something to me very saintly about the teacher image. And I think it was obviously they're on a dais, which is a little bit raised, but not too much. And they often sit very, very still. They, their legs are very flat, often parallel to the cushion with very little movement, very often in white with shawls or like a lighter gray, and soft spoken. And so it's just a very powerful and encouraging, really, sometimes intimidating, just by how peaceful and relaxed they seem to be, and just feels like so out of reach when you're struggling through sittings. But I think there's this among students, there could be kind of an aura of eliteness, of living in a rarefied air, of the specialty of having been chosen to be an AT and in that position, and just a lot of conversations among servers and students I remember of trying to kind of understand what it means to be a teacher, and picking apart that experience, because it just felt like a bridge beyond where we were.
Sure. I'll do my best. Yeah, I'll do my best, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I had that mystique too, right? I mean, I think I told that story earlier about, coming back to the center and seeing, the person who, the director of the, who was my first teacher, just mowing the lawn and being like, what? So there was, and obviously as I became, more involved with the organization, of course I saw just the humanness of everyone, and everyone's, I mean, of course, but I think I would say most of all ATs just have an extraordinary level of inspiration and devotion to their understanding of the Dhamma and to this tradition, and they devote enormous amounts of free time to the organization. Teachers are not allowed to be paid, and I think in today's sort of spiritual retreat context, that is extraordinary. And so the level of devotion that I used to see was amazing. Now, having said that, there were, even in my early years, those early months sitting and serving at the center, I saw a wide variety of assistant teachers, both, international and local and national from across the country. And, there was a variety. I mean, there were some who I was extremely inspired by, and there were others who I couldn't see the human being behind, and I think there are elements of the organization that kind of perpetuate that. And I think that, also began to happen with me as I began to embrace that role as a representative. But I saw all, I mean, by this time I knew many acharyas, and they were just human beings, and they had their faults and they had their shortcomings, as I did. And so when I was being appointed, I was like, oh, well, there was a point where I was like, wait a second, I mean, how can I take this on? It's actually serious. I have to, and, with time I realized, okay, yes, as an assistant teacher, um, I'm sort of, I'm playing a role, and when I'm on the dais, and in terms of, conveying the practice, um, and yeah, I definitely struggled with students who would then put me on a pedestal, possibly, or the distance I needed to. I struggled with the distance I needed to take around sort of, and I remember, I always remember this story, actually, of the Dalai Lama being asked a question around, something about teachers not, when they're sort of off duty or something like that. And he said, "What? Wait, he didn't even understand the question." He says, when you're a Dharma teacher, you are never off duty. And that was such an ideal, I remember, and I was like, oh my gosh, and so I think I just sort of tried to find my own way of navigating that role. Um, and yeah, I mean, it is very human. And I think, there's a lot of sort of Wizard of Oz, kind of curtain, the whole veil of being an AT, and then what the reality of, that everyone, I think, acknowledges that as ATs, um, uh, we're just beginning students ourselves. We're just, trying to make progress. And so that helped me to not to take on, try not to take on any airs around that. Is just to see, and of course, when you go back and sit your retreats as an assistant teacher, you realize, oh, I've got I've got a sewer of a mind here, and it's humbling, and you remember, you remember that, and you do your best, of course, to convey that humility to students so that they don't mistake you in any ways. Yeah, behind the scenes, that's a great question. I mean, in some ways, it's very ordinary, except that I would take periods of 10 days and devote it to just being 24/7 on behalf of 60 or 75 students, and it was an extraordinary experience to watch the transformation from the other side, right? To watch it from the place of a facilitator, and there were elements of it that definitely felt, I would say, rote. There's many aspects of the training of becoming an AT, which is following a script, making it your own, but not veering from a certain parameters, framework. You can, and so I was aware of that right from the beginning. And of course, I had already experienced many teachers who I felt like were just, sort of going through the motions and parroting what Goenka would say, or what many other, so I could already tell that was a part of, the culture of being an assistant teacher, where, there were, it sometimes became a joke about what kind of refrains, an old student could count on hearing from an assistant teacher. And so, trying to, and hoping that I could, be more myself, not sort of, go with those sort of scripted ways, and just to convey, more authenticity. I don't know if I succeeded in that, but I certainly tried. And there were certainly times when I also had to just really, just go by the rules, and make decisions around that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned a bit ago in your answer. You're talking about the identity issue, and about your hesitation with Gurudom and Guruism, and yet also your growing faith and belief in the practice, and the benefit you were deriving from it. It makes me think about my own trajectory, and I'm recalling my second course I did in Japan. And after the course, I sought out one of the teachers, And it wasn't the teacher on my course. He was a teacher who just happened to be at the center afterwards, and hit him with a litany of questions on like day 11 of just like, well, why do we do this instead of this? And shouldn't we be, doing like this? And really just hitting him hard. He's a very critically minded person. I kind of understood things by challenging them and by intellectually digesting them. And he's very compassionate. And I really appreciated the brief interaction we had where he began to answer. And then he just kind of smiled and was like, I think maybe you need to go into your practice. I think your practice is going to start to answer this better than I can. And that was is really a light bulb going off. I mean, it was just after my second course, and it was making me realize that I had, at that point in my life, in my early 20s, I had gone through the world by relying on the power of my mind and critical thinking everywhere I went. And I could see how far that got me, and I could see the shortcomings. And I had come to the meditation center because of the shortcomings, because there was intrinsic pain and suffering and confusion in my life that critical thinking was not solving. And so I was very much of the mindset that I need to do something to move beyond this box of critical thinking, but I don't know how to. And drugs were away, intense experiences were away. And so his answer really, really spoke to my deep sense of wanting to understand the world beyond critical thought. And so I really, that set me on a trajectory for many years of really always wanting to go back to my practice and using my critical thought only insofar as to understand the technique and practice. When this happens, should I be doing this or that? When I'm in this situation, there's this, and really wanting just to get clarification for better practice rather than critical thought on its own. And what, in many ways was consciously, intentionally, both because of myself and my background, as well as the messaging I was receiving from the Goenka organization, was wanting to really, I don't know what the word is, let go or submit or give up or something to my critical thought, to really let that not be such a prominent part of how I understood the world, but to leave that behind, whatever that critical thought, whatever direction it went and whatever it taught me. And I think, looking back on it, I actually think that was a really good decision. I think that's what I needed. I really needed at the time to get out of my head and to insert myself into the practice. But I think for me, it started to feel that there was a time when that critical thought should have started to turn on an increasing capacity. And it wasn't an all or nothing thing. For me, it was something that I had just turned off, and then not deciding to use that tool, it led to other consequences. And it really spoke to me. I'm recalling this book I read one time by Stephen Batchelor. And in the first chapter of the book, he describes an experience where all these yogis that are following the Dalai Lama see I don't know what it was, some kind of seeming miracle take place. Like, I don't know what it was, like rain falling. But then I think that's what it was, actually. I think it was rain was falling, but the hut where the Dalai Lama happened to be in, rain was not falling on that hut. It was just the rain was avoiding that place. And it was kind of in the distance. And the several yogis he was with were saying, oh yes, I see it. Yeah, it's not falling on that. And Stephen Batchelor, as a young man, didn't see what they were seeing. He saw the rain falling everywhere, but because he wanted membership of the group, because he wanted to take on a more spiritual sense of the world, he said, oh yeah, I see it too. That's amazing. That means that he's avoiding the rain. And that anecdote just spoke to me so strongly of so many instances, not quite that glaring and not quite that intense, but so many instances where I intentionally was wanting to push aside my critical thought that was clearly saying one thing, and in order to gain more acceptance and admission into a more spiritual way of looking at things, even when it wasn't entirely felt or witnessed. And another thing I'm recalling is Sam Hara, also in his young years, became very dedicated to meditation. I think it was Mahasi in his case. And he said, at that time, I was so susceptible and so open to wanting to learn something new and go outside of my norms, that when he later learned about the story of John Walker Lynn, he was the American who became a Taliban, also young, impressionable age of his 20s. He said, there's no difference between me and John Walker Lynn. Like, if I had somehow found myself in a community of esoteric Taliban anti-American philosophy, like, I can see myself just as clearly dedicating myself to those extremes as I did intensive meditation practice. I just happened to get one instead of the other. And so this question of like, how to what degree do we balance the critical thought with the faith or the teachings that are coming from a master, there's no exact answer to it, because I still very much believe that if you learn anything from a teacher and you're stuck on your mind and what you're thinking and what you're challenging, you're really not going to learn something. Any act of learning is an act of submission. There needs to be some kind of submission to the knowledge, to the technique, to the teacher, to the organization, to something in order to get new information but that needs to be balanced with some level of critical thought appearing in some time at some form, but not overwhelming, being able to dissect and take apart and look at it. And I know for me in my later development as a meditator established in the practice, to use that word again, I think there were critical things that didn't really hold, but the way I got around that was the whole critical mechanism is flawed in some way. And so this process of examining things in this way is inherently limiting in terms of what I can understand, whereas the practice is not. And so it became almost like a sense of pride to abandon critical thought, even when it was very apparent and obvious that some things were this way or that way, and to replace that with a faith of a teaching in an organization. And it felt really good, and I think that's something that's kind of inherent in humans. I think you study this with religion or political movements or even cults or anything, that there's something that, like, to be doing something that you have so much faith and confidence is the right thing to do, to be following some teaching or some faith which is telling you, in which you really believe, and believe perhaps at the expense of putting aside critical thought in that moment, that this is the right way to live one's life. This is the right action to do. Human life is so confusing. How do you spend the hours? How do you make sense of it? And you can spend so much of your life just lost in this confusion of what to do and how to do it, and never getting any answers, and no one knows anything. And it's the blind leading the blind. That to feel some degree of certainty, some degree of faith, and to see the apparent benefits and results of that faith, it just feels so good to have that kind of certainty and community, that you are doing what you're meant to do. You are spending your time in the right way. To even know this is a better way to spend time, and this is a lesser way, to first know that, and then which that itself is an achievement, and then to select the right way and not choose the wrong way. There's just a sense of clarity and passion and power in that's really fantastic, and just on a inherent fundamental human level just feels really, really good. And I remember what that was like, but I also remember what I gave up to get there. And that, and as I started, these aren't black and white things. As I started, absolutely, I needed to abandon some of that critical thought. It was completely getting in the way from what I was trying to learn. And there's a way, there are lessons that meditation can give you that critical thought cannot. And so, you do need to let go at times, but there are other places where you kind of need a bird's eye view and kind of need to evaluate and look at it with these God-given or nature-given gifts of a mind that's able to dissect things critically and have some trust in how you're analyzing it.
Yeah. I mean, and you speak to something that I think is really universal in many aspects, in many ways, and you're really touching on, I think, to a perspective of understanding, entering into, deep, profound meditation, a path, the path of the Buddha's teaching, the Dhamma. It's a developmental process, and I think you're speaking really very much to the need for balance in these two, the two pieces that you're talking about. This sense of, I think, devotion to one's practice, to just being willing to undergo silence, stillness, and to see what wisdom emerges from that experience. And then, of course, also just this, I also come from a critical thinking background, somewhat academic, and how to balance that, right? And I think for students, for new students, for students coming into the practices, and it's very individual. It's very unique. Certainly as an assistant teacher, I would see students who had an immense amount of devotion, but were not necessarily thinking critically about what they were saying or how they were, kind of couching the whole experience, or in some ways not knowing what to do next. In terms of needing to take a certain step in their practice. Things were very oceanic or universal, or they just all they needed was their devotion. And then you also saw, I also saw students who were, like you're describing yourself, and I also experienced myself, very critical thinking, kind of intellectually oriented, wanting to kind of digest and mull things around, and the need to just, put that aside and just have a sense of confidence and faith in really kind of an unknown sort of developmental process. And so I think the critical piece here is about balancing that and knowing when you need what. And you were also touching upon pieces of this where there can, in certain, traditions, there can be this experience of sort of a group think, right? And of course, if you're entering into a new community like that, you want to belong, you want to be a part of that community. You may rationalize some things away. You may legitimize things that you actually have questions about. I certainly did. I found myself even, quite early on, way before I was an assistant teacher, when I was just serving, courses back back and forth. There were many things I was observing that I felt like I was sort of excusing or saying, okay, well, let me put that aside. There's so much benefit here. And I wanted to belong, right? I wanted to belong. I wanted to be part of that whole thing. I was profoundly, transformed by it. So I wanted to just take it, just to be a part of the whole thing. And yet, as time went on, I found myself, needing to recover my critical voice and critical thinking, and the willingness to kind of examine and question things, rather than to just sort of accept. But there is a place, I think, for that. There is a place, I think, as you mentioned, for just accepting instructions and practice and just trying it, giving it a trial, seeing what emerges, going through that unknown process. I think the problem comes when there's that there becomes a conflict between the two, or when we're getting messages that we shouldn't be critically thinking, or that's somehow a problem. And I think, as I began to get more involved, I think, as an assistant teacher, I did become a little bit more critical, and I also found that I began to hear a lot more. I just got more messages around the resistance to examining and questioning things, and that I needed to not do that. And so that became a concern for me. So you're speaking to a lot of developmental pieces here that, which call for balance, I think, and yet ultimately there needs to be integration, right? And I think that's a key word here, a key piece that was guiding me for a long time is, I found myself wanting to integrate on a lot of different levels. And I think increasingly, as I got more and more involved as a representative, as an AT into the organization, I started to feel like, I can't, my whole self is not able to sort of show up. I had to compartmentalize. And that increasingly became more and more difficult for me.
Yeah, and I think what you're hitting upon as you reach higher levels of the organization, that it's not just a question of compartmentalizing this information for oneself, but it's instructing by, if not formally, by vibe, or by just introducing to the format of the organization and teachings and stuff to the younger generation, the new students that are coming, kind of how to think and in what ways to engage and not engage. And that was what I also imparted to those that were coming, that same, for those things that seemed that were hard to explain or understand, I had the ready-made answers that I think anyone in the organization kind of knows the organization speak of how you respond to this or how you respond to that or what answer you give to this. They're the same everywhere. And I would parrot that. And then when a conversation would try to move beyond that parroting, or I found that there was an intellectual engagement that was beyond my capacity to really adequately resolve and cover it up and finish it, then the answer would just be, well, go to practice. That will give you the answer, because this is all just talking, and this is not, this is not really the practice and not why we're here. And so it was a way to short circuit and cut out that real investigation one way or the other. So I think that became something self-perpetuating.
Yeah, and I think as a culture, the organization sort of fosters a, maybe an overemphasis, I think, on faith, and Goenka certainly gives a huge emphasis on that, on the role of faith. But what I understand now is actually that faith as one factor, and sort of there's a system of looking at sort of what's called the sort of the five friends, faith, efforts, concentration, mindfulness, wisdom. They all need to be in balance, right? And that actually you can have sort of excessive faith, and that will actually undermine your practice and fruition of your practice. And that was, I learned that after I left the tradition, but while I was in the tradition, I felt like that was in many ways a currency that I needed to maintain. And I think in some ways, as you did, when it came time to question things, or when things were being questioned that I couldn't sort of answer except by parroting components of just that faith piece, that I started to feel a certain level of dissonance, really. And I think that the need to belong, fit into that. And what I began to do was compartmentalize. I began to sort of, make excuses, be apologetic in certain departments, but say, yeah, but the benefit is really great, and somehow this is all going to resolve, or maybe the organization is going to evolve and sort of shift this mindset, or shift this piece of the culture. So I could see that the organization, was made up of humans, and as all humans are flawed, and all human organizations are flawed. But what became harder for me was that the organization itself was cast in this sort of light that it could do no, that there couldn't be no shortcomings, or it could do no harm, or and that I noticed that much more after I became an assistant teacher, and that became problematic for me as time went on. And I think I was very focused on, for myself, in terms of integrating the practice in my life. So I we talked earlier, I really fell through the cracks. I took my first course in my college years. I spent and I was able to, because of my economic privilege, to attend a lot of courses, to serve a lot of retreats, and take the time off. And I delayed my own graduation from college for about 15 years. And part of that was very positive. Like, I do not regret that in the least, right? I said to myself, this is higher ed. Taking all these retreats and serving this is higher ed. And yet I was aware, there was a part of me, I went to private schools, in New York, and and they were all sort of conveyor belts to, college graduation and, a typical middle-class lifestyle. And so, there's a part of me that was, sort of still keeping in mind, okay, I need to ground this, even as compelling as sitting these retreats were. I mean, there was a time in my life where I would do a college program for a year, and then, I wasn't sure what was next, so I would do some retreats. then maybe I would work part-time, and then I would quit that job because, a long course was coming up, a long retreat was coming up.
Mm.
And I did that for many, many years. And at the same time, I knew, okay, I need to really integrate this. I need to, there's something profound here. I want to bring it into society at large. I want this to be something that, is not fringe, which it was when I first started sitting. And I want this to be part of the mainstream. What that would be so amazing that if, college students could on a regular basis do these kinds of retreats, that they didn't have to steal away time to do this, or you didn't have to sort of steal away time from work, And I was also watching, the mindfulness movement, sort of led and sort of typified by John Kabat-Zinn's MBSR work, it was taking off. The research was, happening, in the National Institute of Health. And, there was extraordinary, there was such an acceptability that was happening at large, the fact that we got, these 10-day course formats into, correctional facilities, which are essentially paramilitary organizations, right? I mean, that's how they're run, right? And so there was a level of acceptance. I began to see more and more just, your regular, conventional, mainstream corporate folks coming to sit, and it was all, very acceptable. And yet I could also see that there was an underculture, around folk, particularly young folks who were taking retreats of, sort of escapism. And I would say that I certainly took as many years as I could to kind of, buffer from having to deal with society and yet I also, there was a part of me that really wanted, right, society writ large to accept, this, and was scheming in myself how to do that. And in fact, I ended up for my undergraduate degree writing, a 100-page thesis on Vipassana meditation as taught by Goenka, and communication skills. And that was a huge accomplishment for me. It was like, I'm getting the word out at this level, and who knows what the ripple effect will be, right? But that notion of integration became more and more important to me. I saw the pitfalls around, just sort of escaping and doing, retreat after retreat, sitting and not really knowing how to interact with society or interpersonally, or being willing to have relationships, or, hold down a steady job. Like and I saw those tendencies in myself. I saw the desire to escape from that in myself. And so, but partly what was also happening, I think, for me was that I was seeing that I could actually bring this into the world, right? Like I could be a vehicle for actually broadcasting and integrating this into the world in different ways as a college student, just by virtue of working in settings where I could talk about meditation, or influence coworkers to go sit a 10-day course, all that, that was all really important to me leading up to being an assistant teacher. But the need for integration in some ways was even more important as an assistant teacher. One, because as an assistant teacher, again, assistant teachers do not take remuneration for teaching and conducting courses, which is an amazing thing about Goenkaji's tradition. But in order to do that, they either have to be financially independent, or they have to have flexible work situations that allow them to do that. And so they need to be in the world, right? And I think Goenkaji sort of set that up on purpose, so that the offering of the Dhamma was not kind of compromised by financial gain or even sort of professional status.
So I think when one's talking about having faith, there's a lot of different ways that faith can manifest, and particularly when you're looking at Vipassana meditation and practicing some teachings of the Buddha, that this has a very specific form. And I think that there's certainly a faith in the power of these teachings and the benefit that this practice gives you, and a faith that, and I think this is not just true of a sense of following meditation, this is true of really anything you do in life, that whatever you're doing, you start to have a faith that this is serving you, this is doing you well. And so therefore you should invest and do more of it. With meditation, it's a bit of a different animal because it can feel less tangible. It can, you're not necessarily having concrete results, although sometimes you might, but in many ways you're just gradually feeling better in many different ways, and you're overcoming certain inner defilements as well. And so that process of coming out of these defilements can give a kind of faith that, like, hey, this thing actually works. And that was certainly true in my case, where I tried many other things, and this gave me more benefit faster than anything else I'd ever done. So it gave that faith. But then you can also have a faith in the particular teacher, or a faith in the particular technique, or a faith in the organization. And so I think one has to separate and tease these things out, because I think that the way that faith is manifested both in the way it's encouraged and talked about within the Goenka organization, as well as the way that meditators then come to respond and to feel it, is that these two things are one and the same, and they're not really separated out. And it was really, in my experience of going into Myanmar and starting to go to different, to visit and talk to people at different monasteries and meditation centers and everything else. But when looking at developing or encouraging faith among the students, I didn't really feel a sense of trying to instill or inculcate or encourage a faith as a practice of of what one was doing, that one would not just have faith in the Buddhist teachings, but one would have faith in organization and teacher and technique, that this went part and parcel into that. And so that is something unique, and that is a choice. That is a choice that this organization and teacher, meaning Goenka, made in terms of the messaging, to want the faith to also encompass those things. Because I had never gone to other monasteries or meditation centers before, especially in Myanmar, where they're so plentiful, I hadn't seen the possibility for differentiation. I hadn't seen the possibility that one could do this and not this. I just saw everything coming together, and I thought this was the way it had to be. And so it was really eye-opening to me once I saw that there could be a practice where faith in the teachings, meaning the Buddhist teachings and the Buddha as a primary teacher, that faith in this could be disseminated without the tag of faith in the particular and attachment and identification with the particular school that was teaching it. That was, and because I saw that could be done, that could be separated, and it could be done with one without the other, that for the first time, that made me realize, oh, in the Goenka organization, this is a choice. This doesn't have to be this way. This is an intentional additive that, for whatever reason, is being done, that there could be models that don't do it this way and still work and are very effective. And I think that the process of having that faith in those things, not just the overall teachings, but also, and not just meditation as a thing, but particular faith in the teacher, the organization, and the technique, that well, first of all, that does a lot to engender and encourage community. I think that's a really remarkable, in some degree, because it becomes an insular community. But it goes back to that thing where, like, it felt so good to feel part of that like-minded community that knew they were doing the right thing with their time, and that we're supporting each other in order to do it. That was just an amazing feeling that is hard to replicate in other places. And when I would look at other traditions, I have to admit that it was lacking somewhat in terms of that real cohesive community. And, like, in the sense that I could travel around the world, meet a Goenka meditator from anywhere, and immediately feel this sense of solidarity and brotherhood or sisterhood, as the case may be, or just a kind of common language that we both already speak, and that we're able to immediately connect on that level. And that was really a product of creating that community of shared values and commitments that was really a beautiful and wonderful thing in some regard. At the same time, I remember what our friend Zach Hessler has said, that when he looks back on his Goenka years, and he has the observation that really kind of shocked him and hurt him when he realized this, is that when he talked about his Dhamma brothers and sisters, he did not mean people practicing other meditation techniques. He would not look at a Mahasi meditator or a Thai forest tradition meditator or anyone else as a Dhamma brother or sister. That was reserved for people within that tradition. And that was really painful for him to come to that realization. And it also reminds me what you said in a prior interview, that when you heard Goenka talking about the spread of Dhamma around the world and how beautiful that was, over time, you started to realize, oh, he's not talking about the spread of Dhamma. He's talking about the spread of my particular teachings and where they're going. And so I think that this becomes something really hard to untangle. In one way, this sense of faith really helps one to belong, to be part of something greater than yourself, to feel that you're on the right track, and be filled with supportive brothers and sisters who speak that same language, and yet also, this sense of community has its drawbacks in terms of the rigidity uh, uh, of what one is expected to do, how one is expected to think, and what one is not expected to do or think about or talk about. It definitely has those limitations, but these are really nuanced conversations and really hard to take apart and it's very hard to talk about in the way that I think we're trying to do, where we're not trying to exoticize or build up or romanticize the impeccability and infability of a particular organization teacher. We're also not trying to tear it down. We're trying to have a very nuanced conversation of the extraordinary benefit that certain decisions in establishing this tradition have provided on a personal level that we've seen and we've experienced, while also being very honest about how some of those decisions, and very intentional decisions that were made and that were not made in other teachings that were made here, how that created certain barriers and even mental complexes that actually over time started to realize inhibited the very practice and the very progress that the technique was trying to point towards.
Yeah. I think you raise a lot of really important issues here around just how faith is articulated in different contexts. I think, just to go back to, some of the early experiences I think students have on the course, Goenkaji, cites that very famous sutta, I think it's called the Kalama Sutta, where he's, I think, speaking to a particular tribe of folks, and he gives sort of a criteria for, rejecting things. And so he says, it's proper for you, Kalamas, to doubt, to be uncertain. And then he says, don't believe just because you've heard it, or because of tradition, or because of rumor, or because of scripture, or because of surmising things, or because the teacher said so. He says, Kalamas, when you yourselves know these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are censured by the wise, then you abandon them. And the opposite, when you know that these things are wholesome, you can accept them based on your own experience. So it's kind of this caveat that the Buddha himself, and Goenkaji reiterates, gives this caveat around, don't, against blind belief, right? Against blind faith. I think for many, many new students, that's a very reassuring scripture that they understand that the Buddha said 2,600 years ago, because I think there can be this tendency among all of us, for sort of kind of this Pollyanna, kind of thinking, and it's all good, and I can just believe everything. So in some ways, the Buddha is really kind of reinforcing the need for some for critical thinking and relying on one's own wisdom. I think within the Goenkaji tradition, I think the difficulty is that the faith and confidence that one has in one's own practice gets conflated with the necessity for some of the rules and regulations, and for some of the framework around the practice and the practice itself, and the exclusion of other practices that the Buddha gave. But then it also becomes conflated with the way the organization, I think, is operating, right? And even the teacher Goenkaji, and that I think there's some folks who feel like they cannot question at all what Goenkaji says. So I think that's kind of where things can get a little out of hand a little bit, where that type of faith does become, regardless of the caveats given, a blind faith. And I think that there is, as I got more and more steeped in the organization, I saw that their blind faith was in fact sheltered, despite all these caveats. And that was that became kind of concerning for me. So I don't know if that's sort of speaking to some, gives an oversense of it. And I can't, and I certainly can talk a little bit more in details about, some of the things that, but yeah, and I think, I think it also became the whole sense of what was being defined as the Dhamma, right, was being, increasingly conflated, that when Goenkaji was referring to the Dhamma, he was referring really to his method of interacting with the Dhamma, and I remember having to say and hearing, from other old students, but then, having to really distinguish, like, wait a second here, Goenkaji's tradition is not the entire, and the organization is not the Dhamma. As I began to see more and more human, typical human shortcomings that any organization has, and yet the sort of the defenses or the excuses or the kind of whitewashing, based on, well, it's you just have to have faith, those kinds of justifications. I had to tell myself more and more, no, wait a second, the Dhamma, the organization is not the Dhamma. The organization is a group of humans who are, executing an apparatus to disseminate these practices, and only really actually a certain slice of the practices. If you look, and even though that's justified within the context of the framework of the tradition and the practice and the 10-day course and the long courses, it's still just a slice of the entire teachings of the Buddha Dhamma. And so I had to begin to make those distinctions and make those assertions and remind myself more and more as I kind of came upon that kind of, and it wasn't just kind of a blind faith, but there was kind of a rigidity there behind that, and there was also a kind of an arrogance that this was the only way, and I felt that way about it. I felt that this was the only way for a long time. And so I had that, but I also understood the danger of that and felt like I needed to qualify that and allow, newer students particularly to come into it on their own terms, with all of their questions, right? And I think on some level that is encouraged, but at a certain point, again, I think, as students progress to taking the longer retreats, the 20, 30, 45-day courses, and certainly as they become an assistant teacher, that sense of faith gets kind of codified. It gets kind of rigidified. It's not just belonging, but now you're representing, and so therefore you have to be on board in a complete way here. And I think that some of those transitions don't actually, in practicality, in sort of the typical life of a householder, allow new students really the time to digest those decisions around how their sense of belonging to the organizations gets conflated with sort of what's termed as an explicit surrendering to Goenkaji as their teacher and this practice as their only practice, and that this is sort of considered the one and only path. So I think that a lot of stuff becomes it's that sort of Trojan horse process where you kind of get into the fortress and then it becomes a different ball game. And one that, doesn't, provides less and less kind of questioning and examination as you go further in. And then I began to experience that.
Yeah, and I think that this is, when you're looking at the different forms of this faith takes, I think there's one can describe it as something, a starting faith and a more advanced faith and everything in between, in the sense that and then for those that are involved in deeper levels, there becomes something of a very intentional, even though it might be subconscious still, code switching and doublespeak in terms of how you speak to this kind of person and how you speak to that kind of person, and knowing what to say and how to say it. And, I think coming into the course, the Goenka model really fits within this whole wave of what's been called like modern Buddhism or Protestant Buddhism, meaning that in the last half century, this wanting to present a form of Buddhism, quote unquote, that is stripped of its more phantasmical elements and unexplained things, that is described as logical, linear, fitting with the modern age, scientific, etc. Goenka presents the technique like that, and very much so. But he's not. It's not his own creation. He's not alone in that. It's a product of a time that this is what many people were doing in reinventing, and as one does with any kind of spiritual practice or religious practice, finding a way to make it relevant and appealing to the generation that was living then by being able to keep the core teachings, but adapt it in a way that was suitable for modern sensibilities. And so, the 10-day discourses are very much in line with talking about scientific and logical and the mental benefits one gets and the mental balance in a modern world and all of that. And it's really very, very light on the more esoteric and mystical and magical parts of it. But then as one develops, I don't know how much of this is really in the discourses. Like maybe there's bits here or there, but so much of it is just in the culture of the centers, of being involved in the communities, and starting the more you're taking courses and spending time there and having access to various people who've been there longer, the more you're starting to have access to different stories. And these are stories about, the most profound story, the one that you referenced before, is that Seiyaji Ubiken is the next Buddha, Maitreya, that this is, and Goenka it will be his attendant, and that anyone who is, the more closely aligned you are to the individual teachers as people, and as well as the technique itself, the better the chance that you will be born to catch that next sasana. And this is a very real thing. And this is something that, if this was in the dialogue or the description of the meditation technique from day one, if it was on the website, if it was something that was discussed openly, even though everyone that's progressed beyond a certain point in the practice certainly knows this very well, and many the vast majority believe it on some level, either believe it ardently and fervently, or aren't really sure where to hold it, but are a bit scared as well if it's not true. And then there's this whole range of things like the magical powers or reading minds or invisible beings or rebirth, all this other stuff that is talked about very lightly at the beginning, sometimes not at all even later on, but are part and parcel of the conversation in the community that makes up the more advanced stages. And so like this is another example from my experience of how, like, as I would deepen in with the technique and with the organization, I would be privileged to hear more of these stories. And the greater degree that I could accept these stories and believe in them and have faith in them meant that I was closer to the tradition, to the teacher, to the technique, to the commitment and everything else. But there was very much a code switching going on where one would be very mindful when talking to someone of your own station, or perhaps a little higher and more experienced, that, okay, these topics are now open for discussion, and now we can really go there and show faith and belief in all these things that we're talking about and how true they are and how much we as a community support them and abide by them. And this is really why we're practicing and what we believe in. But then when one would talk to someone a bit lower in experience, the real care in what was shared, what was revealed, what was admitted, and this was all done in the purpose of one word that defined everything, and that word was confusion. The word confusion was the verb that was always used to discuss and determine whether or not someone was of a certain station to be able to hear that, and that if someone was just starting out as a new student or was still learning this or that, giving them the real thrust of the intention of where this was going would confuse them, because they didn't have enough experience with the practice to be able to hear that truth and hear that message. And so there was a constant code switching and doublespeak of how one would interface with the outside world, or new students or potential new students, or students that were still finding their way, and then how one would converse with those that were older and more advanced, where you can just kind of relax and sink into this deeper faith. And in some way, there's one anecdote that really illustrated this for me. I was I had, when I was in Myanmar, I had gone to IMC, International Meditation Center, where Sayagyi Bukin taught, Goenka's teacher, and I basically bought every material they had there. Just was like, oh, this is great to have. And one of those things I happened to get was a book of CDs that were all in Burmese, and that was U Bukin talking. And I burned the CDs onto a computer hard drive, and I had no idea what they were saying. Didn't understand Burmese, but just so cool to hear his voice and sometimes meditate to his voice. And it was just one of many files. And I then shared the file, which was many, many gigabytes at that point, with any meditator I come in contact with, to give them discourses and books and whatever else. And that would then get shared and passed around to other people. And there's some really great stuff on here, because some stuff I got from Burma that was just not very easily available in other places. Somehow that whole package of Dhamma material got shared with a teacher. And and the teacher was very alarmed to find that I had access to these talks by Sayagyi Bukin. And so what transpired next was she found out that she had taken a trip to Burma, found out that I was there, and this drive had come from me, found out that I was meditating in Sagaing Hills. And so I was doing a 1-day course in this cave, and literally stalked me, literally sat outside the cave for I don't know how many hours until I was done, and then confronted me and demanded to know where I had got what she was calling contraband material. I was really confused. And she went on to say that, in this discourse, or this conversation, Sayagyi Bukin is having a series of conversations about his encounters with invisible beings and magical powers and all these other things. And this would be very confusing to be able to bring out into the world and have new students and potential students hear and understand. This would give them a very different view of our tradition. I mean, actually, it would give the accurate view, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it would give a very different view to how people look at the tradition and the message we've cultivated. And she went on to explain that she was part of a somewhat elite committee at Dhamagiri that was aware of these discourses and were having discussions about whether or not and how they should be released, and had decided that these cannot be released. And so, because I had them in my copy, I had to be very careful. They didn't know why I had them, and that my long course status was jeopardized because I was potentially sharing something that shouldn't be shared. I simply just said, I got these at IMC. I didn't even know what they were. I just enjoyed listening to them. But the anecdote was startling, really, because it just showed the level of awareness, of sensitivity, of knowledge, of discussion that was taking very explicitly, that was taking place about the knowledge of their primary teacher's teacher, who is expected to be the next Buddha, speaking about things that are completely consistent with the scriptures and with what the Buddha himself said, but was not in line with the way that the technique or the 10-day courses were framed, and so therefore was problematic. Only problematic if it was released and if it was public. It was not problematic if it was elite and in the possession of those that would not be, quote unquote, confused by it, that were developed enough to be able to understand it, but not to those who are still coming around the modernist, rational, scientific, logical framing of it. And so I think, I think that this is just another way that faith can be broken down into all these different elements of what's being told, how it's being told, when it's being told, and to whom.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, first of all, gosh, I'm sorry about that experience about being hounded by the organization's authorities around these materials, and just yeah. And I'm trying to it's I think you speak to a lot of different things here, and you know both in terms of just how the Buddha's teachings began to be disseminated in the post sort of colonial era, modern era, and how it had to be couched in scientific terms for acceptability in the West. And for a long time I thought, well, Goenkaji, I used to compare it to the real sort of stripped down versions that I think we're aware of. I'm thinking more like the sort of mindfulness stress based stress reduction system, which has taken out all of the sort of esoteric aspects of the Buddhist teachings. And I used to think, well, Goenkaji he's really maintained a lot of those things, although it's really very funneled. The whole experience is very funneled, and it's a kind of a graduated revealing. In the long courses, Goenkaji goes heavily into stories about devas and the cosmology of the Buddhist teachings, and how certain practices like the concentration practices are connected to the 31 planes of existence. And so that gets revealed in a kind of a sort of shortcutted version on the long courses, but one is exposed to that. And the presumption is by then, students can either accept or not accept it. Some do, some don't. There's a lot of importance put on what a student is kind of ready to hear or assumed to be ready to hear, based on how new a student or not, or whether they're a Westerner or someone from Asia. There's all these things that I think that has it's been documented before. I think that you're aware of that. Goenkaji was really fielding a lot of different cultures: the Burmese culture, the Indian culture, and then the Western culture, initially from hippies who had were coming to India and rejecting their religion that they maybe they were brought up with, and so there's and I don't know, there's a lot of different contradictions here, through which I think, unfortunately, the way that some of the rigidity in the organization and the way that rules and regulations are played out, you get these kind of sometimes these, I certainly witnessed over 30 years in the organization, almost what I would call witch hunts, really, around this piece of what was considered appropriate or acceptable or a part of the Buddhist teachings, or allowed within the Goenkaji organization. And back then, there wasn't a whole lot of other games in town, right? And there was no internet, so people couldn't go and examine stuff. But now it's like it's all out there, and anyone with an inquiring mind can just go hit a few clicks on the computer and understand aspects of the Buddhist teachings that I think are being I don't know, what's the word, sort of given in these sort of bite-sized chunks, in a kind of, I don't know, rigid formats. And I don't know, I'm not really articulating myself very well here, Joe, but I just think that, again, it's like what you're I think describing is kind of hitting upon some of the strictures and rigidities and a sense of what is the Buddha Dhamma and what is not the Buddha Dhamma, and conflating that with one organization and one tradition's version of that. The organization really sees itself, there's other elements that come into this faith. It's not just a faith in the practice in Goenkaji, in the Buddha Dhamma. It's that this particular tradition is, in fact, the pure and pristine form of the Buddha Dhamma, and then how that kind of playing that out gets enforced, I think, organizationally, culturally, in the way that teachers are trained, and in the way the organization lives in the world, lives in relationship with other Buddhist traditions. What we sort of touched upon here, I think, calls upon into a whole big issue of a type of how do I term this? In some ways, a greater identity, identifying with the whole organization and the tradition as um, as in some ways somehow in and of itself epitomizing the purest of the Buddhist teachings, the purest form of the Buddhist teachings, and that is part of what is gets that messaging both in the longer courses and in the culture of the organization is what you begin to hear more and more of, and it becomes a little problematic because again the organization, the tradition is not the entire Buddha Dhamma. It's a very self-selected part of those teachings, and yet they are kind of articulated and elevated to a level of, well, first of all, couched in these terms of pure and pristine, that they get, that they date back from, this unbroken chain of teachers back to the Buddha. And, all that, again, we're speaking about this, how the need to belong or have faith or confidence in the practice, the tradition, and Goenkaji, how that gets conflated with this larger, and I'm just going to say, mythology, really, because it ends up, when one really begins to examine it, not really being totally true, or being certainly incomplete in its, in the way that it's broadcast.
Yeah, and I think the question also comes with, what does one have faith in? And I think you're right that there's that conflation, and that I think one in the practice might not even necessarily know how to answer. And it would obviously depend on their development. I mean, does one have faith in the value of this 1 hour of meditation, or having a lifestyle of Shila Samadhi Panya, and that alone? Does one have faith in the way the organization administers and carries out these courses, and the teachers conduct them? Does one have faith in Goenka as this primary teacher and source of knowledge and guidance and wisdom? Does one have faith in the more magical elements that behind closed doors is really the topic of many a conversation, and many a confidence in being able to share things that are not to be public, but are very very common conversations, and really make up the meat of the culture once you get more involved? Does one have faith in that? Does one have faith in the ultimate thing, which is that, said in very hushed tones, that Sayagyi Ubakin is the next Buddha, and that proximity, the greater one's proximity to him in the technique, and by virtue Goenka when he was alive, and now I'm not sure how quite that plays out, but certainly proximity to some part of that, meaning dedication, faith, and by faith in this sense, it's really meaning any letting go of any shred of doubt, and doubt comes in the form of critical thinking. So it's really just holding that in a very confident and dedicated and humble and faithful light that this is true.
Yeah, and I think your experience in Myanmar, as mine did for me, when I went there, when Carolyn and I went there, you start to experience Dhamma centers or monasteries where there is this incredible devotion to the Dhamma, but they're not necessarily slicing and dicing and making distinctions, or calling their particular focus or emphasis the only way, and that they recognize that there are many ways, and and I think on some level, it's funny, in some of the long courses, Goenkaji himself acknowledges that as well, and kind of in his own way acknowledges that he has chosen, the objects of Vedana, and Anapana, particularly for specific reasons, because a large majority of people will be able to work with those objects, and that, and so he on one level he does sort of distinguish it, and then on another level, it is really seen as the only way, right? So there's there's this sort of double messaging that is going on, that just and listen, I also want to I want to also just make a distinction here around there's a spectrum, just because you've been in the organization for
Hmm.
30 or more years or however many years, and even if you're an AT, there's a spectrum of where
Mm,
people fall and what they accept on this spectrum.
sure.
So, there's some full, teachers, acharyas, who, feel like, listen, I'm just here to improve my life, in incremental ways, and that's it. I'm not interested in pagodas or devas
Mm,
or future lives or past lives or who's going to become, the future Buddha. I don't care about any of that stuff.
right.
And they are administering and conducting the retreats, with that level of engagement, and they, and they leave students, process of embracing all the other aspects, esoteric and otherwise mystical aspects of the Buddhist teachings, to their own evolution around that. So there is room, but there also is a sense of, I think, as one sort of, I'll just say it in these terms, ascends the ladders of the organization around, AT, senior AT. I think there is a currency that the
Right.
more devotion around these esoteric aspects, and particularly in where Goenkaji fits in that, and a narrative even around, serving the tradition, and serving the mission of Goenkaji's mission. And even though I would acknowledge there's a lot of confusion around the messaging on that. Is it are we was Goenkaji just distributing seeds for the masses to just get a taste of the Dhamma, or is this tradition really a tradition that is supporting students to attain the highest levels of liberation, nibbana? And both those messages are given right from the get-go. You hear
Hmm.
that right in the 10-day course. And I think there's a lot of confusion as you begin to enter the organization about that, because there are certain things that are emphasized, and other things that are not. Certainly the organization is, developing centers. I mean, there's already, I think, almost 200 or more than 200 centers around the world, and the pace that it continues, the need for more and more teachers to, teach the courses, and centers that are popping up around the world is continuing. And so, there's a justification that, of this need to sort of just spread the seeds of the Buddhist teachings. But then there's this other part of the culture, which is this, really this sense that this is the be and end all, pure and pristine way, that the Buddha, really taught, to reach liberation. And then there's kind of a superiority, a sense of arrogance around that, a sense of insularity, that all these other traditions are teaching, essentially either polluted or contaminated or diluted versions of the Buddha Dhamma. And that becomes, I think, something that, you can't help but, ingest as a representative of the organization.
There's a couple things that come to mind in hearing what you said. I mean, one is I just appreciate your more nuanced analysis of the ways that the different members and especially teachers take in and imbibe the information. That really speaks to what kind of mind it is, how susceptible that mind is, how to what degree this kind of methodology and faith starts to kind of get ingrained and reshape that mind, and to what degree it might resist it, or to what degree it might just not even pick it up and just not be so interested and not a big deal. And we'll get into this in a future conversation, but as I went to Burma and started to do a lot of my own travels and research and conversations, and found that many actually of the things that Goenka says in discourses are really not quite accurate to my understanding of modern day Myanmar, Burmese history, or other things, when I would share some of those examples with meditators that were in the Goenka tradition that were very serious, some of them, like me, were very confused and disturbed and resistant and didn't really know what to do with this, and it really bothered them on a deep level. Others could care less, and I couldn't really understand that because that was not my mind, but I recognized that was their authentic response, is that they just didn't care. Or to say they didn't care is not the right way to say it. They did care, but it had absolutely no impact on why they were doing the practice or how they were going about it. They were fascinated and they loved what I was doing. It presented zero challenge, zero it did not do anything with hindering their faith and their practice. Whereas others, it was a major hurdle, or it was a major hurdle that really upset them and they had to deal with what it meant and how to integrate it, or they responded very aggressively by trying to shut down the argument in whatever way they could, whether it was picking apart what I was actually saying or whether it was going after me and starting to make personal attacks or insinuations about my character or my mental state or, my intentions or something else. But these are different minds that are responding to this in different ways. And I think it's very important to understand that, and also to take responsibility that in my case for the ways that it was harder for me and that I was susceptible to believing certain things, and that when the process of encountering information in the world and in scholarship, which contradicted what I was learning about the methodology behind the technique, upset the very practice of the technique. That was my experience. So I think that's also good to say and to put out there. The second thing that I get from your conversation that I was hearing was that going back to this kind of doublespeak, and doublespeak might not be quite the right word for it. I don't know what is, but to break it down, what I found is that Goenka's discourse of written and oral things is very wide. He has said many different things on many different topics, and people who have devoted themselves to this technique know his expressions almost as scripture. I mean, know that, in the 30th minute of the 7th day discourse, he says this, or in the afternoon instructions on day 6, he says this, or in this question and answer, this VRI publication published in this year, he answered in this way. So his answers become some kind of like scriptural authority of what he said and how he said it. I remember one time saying to a friend, that dawned on me, I said, if you were in an argument with a fellow Goenka meditator and you were disagreeing about something related to anything, technique or organization or practice or whatever else, and you wanted to prove your point, would you be more successful proving your point by quoting something from the Buddha or by quoting something from Goenka? And he said, hands down, you would be much more effective in quoting something from Goenka. From the Buddha, they would say, oh, well, yes, but the Buddha, you have to look at scholarship and how it's been, all these different things would come out. But with Goenka, it'd be very clear, well, he said this, and we now have a precedent, and that's the key thing there. This is a precedent for how we analyze the situation. Just to go off on a little tangent before I get back to my point of doublespeak, it reminds me of, like, I've had conversations with people that, well, I'll just reference the two things I'm thinking of, actually both Kiwis, both New Zealanders. I had Jared Newall on a podcast recently, and he talked about how he wanted to be a monk during the pilgrimage to Burma. And teachers were discouraging him from that. And he went to see Goenka himself and had a conversation in which Goenka also discouraged him. But Jared kept pushing and kept saying, well, I really want to be it. And Goenka kind of threw his hands up and said, okay, you want to be a monk? Fine, be a monk. And Jared put that in his back pocket, and no one could do anything with it because this was a verified quote and permission by the teacher that was, even though it came in kind of in a somewhat amusing form, but this was a carte blanche for whatever he wanted to do. And because there was precedent, no one could say or do anything about his decision to be a monk and not lose out on his status with the Goenka organization. I'm also reminded of a conversation I had with Ross Reynolds, the center manager of New Zealand, where when I was visiting that center, he showed me with some pride that on their vast wilderness land, they had kutis that were kind of in the style of monks in the forest. And he said that this was very discouraged at centers, but that he had somehow finagled a way to get direct permission from Goenka that was on record, that he was able to do it. I think it was one of the last things, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't want to quote Ross because it was years ago. So if he's listening to this, he can correct my understanding of it. But from my memory, he was one of the last things Goenka did before his demise was that he granted permission on the record to Ross to construct these. And so New Zealand is the only center in the world, as far as I know, that has anything approaching Kutis, because there was a precedent, there was a state, something on the record stated, irrefutable, that was from the teacher himself. And so there was nothing that anyone could do. But getting back to this concept of what I'm calling double speak, and it might not be the right word for it. We can work that out later. And looking at the just the vast, incredible, critical importance of the primary teacher abiding by something or saying something. What I find in this vast amount of written and oral things that Goenka's put out there is that he's pretty much responded on most topics in a wide variety of ways. And so it becomes possible to whatever argument one is giving for, well, they should do this better, or they do this which is harmful, or there's this thing which is not quite clear. It's very possible for someone to go back, as you referenced in your last answer with this this citation of a sutta where he references not to believe something just because your teacher says it. So anyone that ever engages in an argument about how there's any sense of blind faith or lack of critical thinking in the Goenka organization, it could easily be challenged or shot down by saying, no, Goenka, 10 minutes, he taught, on day 3 of this time and this, this place, he said these words exactly. Like the fact that he said this, that he was so clearly saying, so clearly articulating that your own practice needs to lead the way. How can you possibly have this argument? How can you possibly say that this is what he was intending, or this is the culture of the organization, when he so clearly says this? And of course, organizations are fallible creatures, and even ATs get confused and, do things overzealously. But this was certainly not the intention, because you could see right here how clear he was in articulating how the practice was supposed to unfold and how the centers and the organization was to be set up. This is on the record, and it's irrefutable. And what I find when you have enough of these conversations, that any argument that's posed, there is something that he said somewhere that is a direct challenge to that statement, and authentically a challenge to it. Yeah, well, that's right. And if you start to go down the road of challenging, like, well, what did he say this time, and what did he meant? It's you kind of get lost in this in a discourse of, well, I think this, but he said this, and so it's other people carrying out that understanding. And that's in all these kind of confusing conversations. That's where our friend again, Zach Hessler, came up with this term that he coined of take-home message. What is the take-home message? And that's a way to circumvent these arguments where, when you're talking about blind faith or being closed to other traditions, or being, having a sense of the arrogance with the pristine purity or lack of critical thought, whatever one wants to go into, there is always going to be some phrase somewhere in the corpus that very eloquently and powerfully speaks against this argument that it could be this way, rather than getting bogged down and citing this over here, that over there. One has to look at, well, what is, okay, yes, he said this, but he also said that. And we also see this as an example. And so if you just back away from trying to prove legal cites of what he said here versus what he said there, I think the way to look at it, as Zach coined and encouraged, is what is the take-home message? Sure, he said that, but how is it being enacted? How is the culture actually taking shape? And if you were to speak in this way or that way to an insider and someone higher up, which one would be more natural and more normative and follow more the convention and the flow? Well, that's your answer. And so I think that because Goenka spoke on so many topics from so many different angles.
Well, you said a lot of great things. I'd love to touch on, if you don't mind, if I
Sure.
To take riff off of some of the things you mentioned. I think well, I mean, let's just start some context. Just from the 10-day course. Toward the end, at the end of the 10-day course, Goenka talks about his own history coming into contact with his teacher Sayagyi Bakin, and sort of the timing of all of that. And he dates it to I think the timing of the Sixth Council, the worldwide Buddhist councils that have been held since the Buddha died. that I think occurred 1954 to 1956, and he kind of associates, the year that he got the Dhamma with that council as being, which is also associated with the heralding in the Burmese tradition of the beginning of the sort of second cycle of the Buddhist teaching. So there's a belief, and again, I'm not sure where this originated in Myanmar, but there's a belief that the Buddha's dispensation, is strong for I think 200, 500 years, and then it begins to disappear and dissipate, and then it's it revitalizes, right? And so according to that narrative, Goenka connects his receiving of the Dhamma from Sayagyi, and then his bringing it back to India, as the birthplace of the Dhamma, as in some ways as he begins to position himself, right, in terms of that timing and in terms of and talking about how he received this pure jewel of the teaching from Sayagyi. And there is, of course, a huge focus on practice, with, again, I would say the takeaway home message around pariyatti is, yeah, it's important, but not as important as patipati in terms of, being able to gain liberation. And so, so that sort of sets, I think that sets a kind of a foundational context for some of what you're pointing out, because and my own experiences is that because I early on because I do have an academic background, I got into reading the Pali Canon and studying Pali, and although that was encouraged, I was aware that it was very few old students who were doing that, very few assistant teachers who were doing that. And that, in some ways, sometimes my breadth of knowledge around the suttas would get questioned in terms of what was being emphasized in the tradition. And the takeaway home message I was getting was that, Goenka essentially is the harbinger of the second sasana, the Buddha sasana, and that, we're here to fulfill this message as a pure and pristine form of the Buddha's teaching. And so, it was almost as if Goenka himself was being elevated, above the Pali Canon as evidence of the scriptural, the Buddhist scriptural, heritage, but even in some ways above the Buddha himself as a result of that, and that's why you're what you're saying here in terms of someone quoting the Buddha as opposed to Goenka would have a better chance of defending some rule or regulation or even understanding of the Dhamma would fly, because there's a sense that, well, this is a tradition of practitioners, and the evolution of the Buddhist teachings was that it became more, it converted much more to rites and rituals and intellectual recitation, and less on practice, and that there were fewer practitioners, and certainly fewer practitioners, who were becoming liberated, and that was by the mid 20th century, that was just a trickle, and this is now the revitalization of it, and this is the bus to get on, basically, and I think that there's a certain organizational kind of arrogance and superiority. In fact, I would say even supremacy. I would use that word here in operation, that I would even say has racial implications, actually, given just the history of how the Buddhist teachings came back from Asia, in neocolonial times, and how it, just the whole way in which imperial countries translated the scriptures, and then in the successive waves in which it found itself in the West, you have a whole you have a spectrum around how much of the esotericism and how much of the scientificism was emphasized, but you also have who's able to access this in the population, and what is the how diverse are the students who are receiving the Dhamma, and how inclusive are the Buddhist traditions. All those things play a role here, but just getting back to this notion that I think is actually in some ways the take home message, is that somehow Goenkaji's tradition and Goenkaji himself is kind of articulating or reforming the Buddha Dhamma back to some notion of its sort of pure and pristine form that had gotten muddied by centuries of evolution. Essentially, that became really difficult for me to stomach as I began to see sort of the arbitrariness in which different rules and regulations were being articulated or enforced because of a kind of a case by case, what you're describing in terms of just kind of how arbitrary it is. You could say, well, Goenkaji said this at one time, or he said this at another time, and it's true. I think while he was alive, he did swing a lot. His pendulum swung a lot on different issues, different even rules and regulations that by which the centers operated with, because he was, I think, himself quite flexible in that. But I think we are sort of witnessing ways in which the organization is kind of ossifying around some of those messages and what is actually kind of being, and I'll just sort of leave it at that for now, because I think that could become a whole conversation in itself later on. We keep deferring so many conversations, Joe.
Yeah, well, it's a multi-year long process. This is the culmination of, and will be a continuation of as well. And I think that I mean, even having, as we talked before this interview, even having this conversation is I hope that listeners that are hanging with us this far in the conversation are not seeing this as an authoritative discussion or outlay of what they need to believe and how things really are. That's certainly not my intention. That's never been my intention. It's rather to encourage them to join us on an exploratory and critically minded and faith-minded journey to be discovering this, and that there are certainly things I'm missing and not fully understanding, and so really we're hoping that a conversation like this is laying the grounds to have more and more conversations online, offline, among ourselves, among yourselves that are listening, and all of this.
My hope is that it engenders more critical examination and allowances and permissions for that without that being a threat, because I think I experienced that as being considered a threat so much while I was in the organization. I wouldn't be where I am today without Goenkaji's tradition. I am fully and wholeheartedly established in the path of Dhamma because of Goenkaji, and I carry that sense of gratitude and devotion, and I know that may sound a little trite coming from an ex-18-year-old student, because that's sort of the language Goenkaji students are always using. Oh, I'm so grateful, and I have a debt of gratitude, blah blah blah. But I really actually I authentically feel that, even though I'm no longer in the tradition, and I see so much of the experiences I had. I see that there were pieces of this, the pieces of the organization. I saw myself. Let's just say I see the traits in myself that I needed in some ways. An organization like this, I think, and for whatever reason, that the that kind of certitude that we were speaking to, that comes from wanting to belong to such an idealistic tradition, and then also in some ways even the arrogance of wanting it to be, the purest and the best and the real, path to liberation and the only one, right? And everyone else is, to quote Goenka, everyone else's doctors are no good, although, I wanted that, right? I wanted that. And I fell into, I think, out of my own defilements or my own negativities or my own shortcomings, a need for a kind of a superiority around that as well. And so, unfortunately, I think that's why those pieces were inside me, I think, or those seeds were in me. And in some ways, the organization and tradition gave shelter to that and allowed those, unfortunately, to express, and allowed me to kind of also become insulated around all that. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but at some point I began a questioning process, and I think when we continue next, I'd love to pick up on how that began, as an AT, as someone who was, really fully involved on many levels. I was not, I was only an assistant teacher. I was not a senior or full teacher, but I was very involved with the organization on many ground sort of breaking projects and initiatives within the organization. And at some point that, I began to start to question things, and maybe we can just leave that for the next time and pick up there.
So yeah, I think that another way that this modeling takes shape is that I think Goenka did set a model for this kind of doublespeak where one is talking one way to outsiders and to newcomers and to those who are starting to practice. And again, I think the methodology behind is relatively benign. I think, at least it was in my mind, it was that I don't want to say something that will confuse them. If we talk about these deeper parts of the practice, then that will confuse them and take them astray, and really just have them being sold on this more straightforward, digestible message. And then as they start to develop more, then these other things can come in. I mean, that was the mindset in how I looked at it. And it made sense, it made sense at the time. I mean, I also realized as I was doing it, there was this double speak going on, but it also made sense in this other kind of rationale. But I think what one finds is, with the vast corpus of what Goenka has said, and then with the more internal behaviors of how one actually believes, how one holds faith, how one carries oneself, there are these inherent contradictions. And there's contradictions on many, many points. There's contradictions on outwardly presenting the practice in this Protestant Buddhism, modern Buddhism kind of format, where it's, and I understand people out there will say that Goenka was not teaching Buddhism. This is not the time to get into a conversation on that. It's more, modern Buddhism is a academic term that describes the way that Goenka was presenting the Buddhist teachings, where it was being presented in a more linear, rational, scientific, logical method that suited modern day sensibilities. And that was the outward facing practice. And yet the inward facing practice is one of belief in rebirth, in supernatural incidences and in abilities, reading minds, flying through the air, whatnot, in belief in Seajubakin being the next Buddha. So these are examples of beliefs that were held internally, and yet outward facing ways of expression where vast evidence was found in the corpus of Goenka to support that view.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to, I think what you bring up, again, there are a lot of pieces here. And I guess I just want to sort of summarize and just hope we can really both speak to like how these different parts get sort of conflated in the organization, how its mission itself is, there's a kind of double messaging around that, and then, but yet, there is this overall, the take home message, if you're inside the organization, is that this is the only way. Right. I mean, over and over again, this is the pristine pure teachings of the Buddha. And so, I think all that sets up, it sets up issues around examining and questioning that I think become problematic, even while the practice may be having benefit, right? And I think what you're describing a little bit is also, in order to kind of continue to sort of stay in, you find yourself sort of compartmentalizing these pieces, and then to some degree, you at least for me, and this was a big piece. I found that I was compartmentalizing parts of myself, and so I really hope we can dive into that process and kind of what began to kind of allow me to sort of examine that and to kind of unravel it, and so I'm looking forward to that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this has been a long extended talk here. It's been wonderful and opening up a number of things to explore. The next one to me being Burma. I mean, this is, for goodness sake, this is Insight Myanmar podcast, and something like 5 hours in, we're finally getting to the topic of Burma. So, so that's, so we have our topic next time. And thanks so much for breaking into some of these, this really interesting stuff, hard to talk about as well sometimes. And thanks for showing up for that.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. As always, it's a pleasure to just have this back and forth and exploration and examination of what's, of our experiences, with Goenkaji's organization. I definitely look forward to continuing.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. As regular listeners are aware, we often remind our audience about our nonprofit mission, Better Burma, at the end of a show. Truth be told, fundraising is hard work, and I can personally attest to the fact that it's really no fun to keep asking for contributions. Yet, the situation on the ground now in Myanmar is so distressing that we continue to do so on behalf of the Burmese people. What is most helpful at this time are recurring donations, which help alleviate both the stress and time involved in fundraising. If you are able to pledge a certain amount per month, our team can plan around having at least a consistent minimum amount to work within each month. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKA CRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranamano